I hope this video finds you quite well. We'll talk today a little bit about the Communist Manifesto. Lots of your questions were on that, particularly on the bourgeoisie. So I picked a few of those that we'll chat about in this video. Let's start. This first one. It says here, the lumpen proletariat, the dangerous class, the social scum, that passively rotting mass, thrown off by the lowest layers of old society, may here and there be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it for far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. Who exactly falls under the category of lumpen proletariat, and how do they compare to the bourgeoisie? Which is worse for the true proletariat or revolutionary? I don't quite understand that last part. Which is worse for the true proletariat or revolutionary? Okay. Which is a little bit about the lumpen proletariat, right? Which just from the quote there that you have, right? We've got this idea of it's thrown off by the lowest layers of old society, right? Pre-bourgeois society there, and I suppose to the point that it exists today, right? The idea is that if you have a group of people, if you have a class of people who are not perhaps the working class, right? They're not able to sell their labor for money, or they're not engaged in that. They don't identify their interests with the proletariat. If we think about the proletariat, right, it's being concentrated in cities. If we read the rest of the article, the rest of the manifesto, it's concentrated in cities. They're selling their labor. When they're selling their labor, they're making only just enough to maintain their life, right? And so they're not, they're building capital. They're contributing to sort of the capital that's owned by the capitalists, sort of collectively by the capitalists. But they themselves are not enjoying any of the benefits of that capital. The only thing that they get from contributing to the system is just the ability to stay alive, right? They're just having their lives sustained, only enough to sort of buy the necessities of life. So that's the proletariat. The lumpen proletariat, a separate class then, it sounds like to me, a separate class, the lowest layers of the old society, and they are susceptible to, it says here, right, their conditions of life are prepare the lumpen proletariat far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue, right? Where I think it goes on from there to talk about strike breakers, right? Scabs, where the proletariat start to fight, and I think Marx and Engels, they talk about, this fight sort of already started. The proletariat are not fighting all together as a class, but here and there, particular parts of the proletariat are taking on particular bourgeoisie, parts of the bourgeoisie in particular geographic areas, in particular fights. But as those fights occur, perhaps in the form of a strike, right, where the proletariat withhold their labor in want of better conditions, in sort of the hope of winning better conditions from their capitalist oppressors, I suppose. Then it sounds like this other group, the lumpen proletariat, who are not part of the proletariat, they're coming in to maybe to fill in during a strike, right? They'll work for lower pay. So it's a class that's poorer, I think, than the proletariat, that perhaps is without jobs and is reliant, and sort of is prepared therefore because they have no jobs, and because if you think about it, if the proletariat, if all they get from their labor is the ability to stay alive, this lumpen proletariat must be a very wretched class, right? Who are not even being able to stay alive, perhaps. And so, of course, you can see from their point of view, if there's a chance there to sustain themselves through breaking strikes, right? Through coming into work when nobody else will come into work, then that's what the conditions of their life is preparing them for, to do that sort of thing. And of course, you can see how it's quite helpful for the bourgeoisie to have that class, right? To have that underclass. And I just use the word underclass there. That's a much more modern term. I think this underclass is what we'll hear a lot about today. And usually when we hear that word underclass, we're looking at people who are not employed, who are reliant on government transfers just to stay alive. So the thing is, it's not a one-to-one comparison, right? I mean, I don't want to get too much into just my own views on this, right? But one of the things that seems to me to be occurring in a way that Marx really didn't envisage or doesn't really allow for is that, these days the proletariat, as far as a proletariat exists, working class as far as it exists, and we can sort of identify that the majority of us probably belong to a class that only have their labor to sell, right? So we only have our labor to sell. I only have my labor to sell. I don't have vast amounts of capital or enough capital to sustain myself without working, right? And that goes for, I think, the vast majority of people in society, which is something that Marx is noticing here, right? We're by far bigger numbers, right, than the bourgeoisie, who alternatively do have the capital at their command, who do command capital to such a degree that they can sustain themselves and have a nice life from just capital. But one of the things that seems to me to be the case is that those of us that do rely on our labor, we're not only surviving, right? We're not only sustaining our lives. We have sort of slightly better lives, I think, these days than the lives of the factory workers of the 19th century in Manchester, right? And so it seems to me that the proletariat, the working class, has not really become immiserated. We're sort of having nicer and nicer lives, and whether surely you can come along and say, well, it's not really, like Marx did, right? You've got a false consciousness. Really, you're just one paycheck away from ruin and from starvation, which I think is certainly more true for some people than for others. We don't feel immiserated, perhaps in the same way that we would have done as factory workers in the 19th century. So anyway, but so that's quite a long aside, basically, that's setting up this next comment, I suppose, on the lumpen proletariat, is that if you're trying to compare and say, okay, who are the proletariat today? Okay, it's those who just rely on their labor in order to live. But our lives are a little bit, but the revenue, I suppose, that we derive from our labor is usually enough to give us a fairly comfortable life, certainly more comfortable than the 19th century. And so then if we're trying to look for a lumpen proletariat, or if we're trying to, which is what this all started with, if we're trying to sort of liken this sort of underclass that we might have today, that are unemployed, that are relying on government transfers, that are a proportion of the population, where they either can't work, or they, for whatever reason, they don't work, and they receive, sort of very minimal assistance from the government that allows them to survive, barely survive, and not much else. If we're trying to sort of compare those two classes with what Marx is confronted with in the 19th century, then I think we're a little bit off, personally. But we might want to start there as a sort of a question, right? Is the underclass, are those people who are long-term reliant on government transfers for their life? Are they a lumpen proletariat who are ready at any stage to sort of step in? And that's part of the argument of sort of modern socialism. Socialists today will say, look, we're sort of forced into work, and prices are forced down, right? With the threat that, well, if you don't do it, well, there's plenty of unemployed people who are looking for a job, who are willing to step in and do what you are not willing to do for that price. They'd be glad of a job at that level of wages, right? And so that you can see how that would keep the prices down, the price of labor down, and so then the lumpen proletariat becomes a potential threat to the proletariat, right? A potential threat to the working class, I think, is what Marx is pointing out there. And of course, he does say that, look, sometimes they are swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. I taught a class last semester about inequality in the world, and this is one of the things we talked about quite a bit, was how to unionize, how it was one of the books we were reading was sort of looking into how to unionize irregular workers, informal workers, workers in the informal economy, right? Because I think partly from this perspective of Marx, right, this Marxist perspective of, well, if you have this whole other class who are willing to step in when there's a strike or something like that, then that undercuts the power of the workers to improve conditions for themselves. So I hope that gives something of a commentary on that, and maybe some sort of ammunition for some discussion and for some thought on that. The next one is this: the bourgeoisie, whenever it has gotten the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic reactions. There on page 245. How have these instances occurred? Where does the bourgeoisie get this power from? I want to say that is it definitely reactions or is it relations? Because when I'm looking at that, I'm remembering a lot of what he said about the change in the nature of relationships in society. I remember for Marx, it's the material powers of production, right, that are sort of at the base of society, that are determining our relations of production. And so he talks a lot in the Marx and Engels. They talk a lot in the Communist Manifesto about the sort of the breakdown of this former feudal system that belonged that sort of had these very sentimental ideas of relationships, right, and sort of the relationship between the lord and the peasants, right, that worked on his land. There was some sort of maybe even a religious element to that, right? There was some sort of esteem, some sort of honor, some sort of a reverence, right? For, I think he mentions like poets, priests, scholars, there's some sort of reverence that they're held in there. Well, the bourgeoisie does away with all of that, right? Those sorts of relationships, those sorts of relationships of reverence, really just are done away with. And where does it get the power from to do it? Or how have these occurred? And Marx and Engels, they say it's the rise of the bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie society, right, which is a change in the material forces of production, have led everything just to have a price, right? It's all relations of self-interest and price now. There's nothing mystical or religious or reverential about it, right? It's in your self-interest to sell your labor to me for a price, right? To sell your labor to a cap, and I have no sort of godly responsibility towards you, right? Destiny or the heavens haven't sent me into this position to look after you and to provide for you and to have some sort of a relationship with you. No, the only relationship you and I have is you sell your labor at a certain price and I buy it from you, and I own that labor that you sell to me, and that's the only relationship that we have. And I don't know, in terms of like where does this come from and where does they get the power from, but I don't know, I guess growing up in bourgeois society, I suppose, right, in terms of the current economic system, the capitalist economic system, that does seem to me to be where the power lies, right? The power seems to lie in the market, right? What will the market pay for this commodity? What prices will the market bear? What can you get for that commodity? That seems to be sort of the main rule there, right, in the capitalist economy. And so sort of considerations of status, of status sort of ascribed from birth, and that sort of thing, that sort of pales in comparison to the profit motive, right? How much does that buy you, right? Yeah, sure, you've devoted yourself to philosophy, and you live a life of learning and that sort of thing. Okay, well, what does that buy you, right? What sort of demand is there for that? That's the main consideration. This is what Marx is getting at, right? Yeah, so you've taken vows to serve God all of your life. That and $2.88 will get you a Big Mac, right? What's the value of that? The value of that in bourgeois society, what Marx is saying, the value of that is purely measured in in dollars and cents, although maybe he was talking more about pounds or marks or something. Yeah, and where does it come from? And I suppose like the ultimate answer, whenever we're asking where does that power come from, right? The ultimate answer for Marx is probably always, what's the material forces of production, and who can control those material forces. And in the bourgeois society, I think we can change its name to capitalist society. I think we would be referring to the same thing. Bourgeois society, the ascendant sort of material of production. I mean, there's a lot of them. If we break it down, but we can conglomerate that all in capital. Right? That's the leading force of production is capital, and being able to own capital. Land, which may have given some nobleman all sorts of power and esteem in the old order, that's gone away now. Right now, it's about capital, and so if you can have as much land as you like, if you haven't got capital, it doesn't do you any good in this system. So yeah, hopefully that's sort of given some answer to that, and again some details and some room for discussion and for debate on that one. Where did they get its power from? They get their power from the ownership of capital. How did it go from one state of affairs to the other, right? Capital became more important than land, I think, is a quick answer to that. And of course, there is more of an answer in there, but maybe not much more of an answer in the Communist Manifesto than that. Yeah. But yeah. Okay, so I will now go on to the next question, right, which is this: of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. I want to be careful with this because he also says the bourgeoisie is very revolutionary as well. He sees this as a Marx and Engels, they see the bourgeoisie as a very revolutionary class as well, the bourgeois class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. Very nice. Why is the rivalry just about the bourgeoisie and proletariat? The elite or the ruling class has usually the most control over people. Shouldn't the bourgeoisie and proletariat be up against them? Aha. Okay, I'm going to shut this door a second. Brilliant. I mean, this is a big part of the theory. I think, for me at least, this is one of the most important parts of the manifesto, right? Because the claim from Marx and Engels is that old elite, that old system, right, where we had multiple classes, a lot of different classes, right? Who can I remember from there? Right? We had landowning aristocrats. We have the burghers, right, in the towns. Sort of the free men and all that. We had the peasants, we had the serfs, and people living off the land. Marx and Engels are arguing that in the old system, under the feudal system, we had actually a lot of distinct classes of people. Right? We had kind of a multiplicity of groups in society. We had the old guilds, different guilds depending on what you were making and what you were manufacturing. They're all swept away, right? And we're left with, bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Of course, he mentions also the lumpen proletariat as well, which we've already discussed. But majorly, right? We're left with two major classes now. We used to have many, and now we have just two, right? And you've definitely hit that on the head there. Whereas, why is the rivalry just about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat? And I like your suggestion, right? You're saying the elite or the ruling class has usually the most control over people. Shouldn't the bourgeoisie and proletariat be up against them? And I think in the beginning they are, right? I think in the beginning, the bourgeoisie in particular, so the bourgeoisie replaces that old elite and probably becomes the elite, right? But they replace that old landowning aristocracy. Right? And I always just think of it as a move from land to capital. Right? What got you power in the feudal system? Land. If you owned the land, and sort of your fealty to the king, right? And the king would grant you land, and that was the best thing you could get. Really, it was just more land, and that's what made you powerful. The ones with the most land were the most powerful, and the ones with less land were less powerful, and the ones with no land were not powerful at all, right? That was the system. But in the change of things, and Marx and Engels, they really think that this is a huge change. They say, look, the bourgeoisie comes along, right? And it starts, when does it start? Where does it start? It starts with the beggars, sort of the free men, the free traders of these new towns, these towns that are sort of small but maybe growing. And what happens, I suppose, in the world to make this shift, to make this change, is discovery. Right, we go around the Cape. We have the East India Company. We discover America. Now, say Marx and Engels. Now, what matters is trade. Well, and who are the traders? It's these free men in the towns. It's these beggars. Now there's huge demand for their services. So now that's probably the moment where we move from land to capital in the Communist Manifesto. So now it's about being able to go and buy things and sell them, and to manufacture things, and to manufacture them on a large scale, and to have the capital, the large amount of capital. He says, what does he say about large amounts of capital? This is when he's talking about the petty bourgeoisie, right? So he's saying, look, the sort of small shopkeepers and those types of, small landlords, I own a couple of houses or something that I rent out, something like that. The capital that they can command is too small to really compete with these people who have much larger capital. But the source of this much larger capital seems to me, from reading this Communist Manifesto, the source of that seems to be trade, and it seems to be these new markets, massive markets in the Americas, in the East, because he says, this is a worldwide movement. He says in individual countries, cities, right, where the burgesses live, the beggars are the free men of the towns where they live, they become the center of power now, all of a sudden. And the countryside, the large manors of the countryside, they become subject to the towns. But he says on the global scale also, the capitalist bourgeoisie countries become master and center, while the East, he says, but the less, we might call them less developed, but the less capitalist, right, the more countryside, the more country side focused countries become dependent on the more capitalist countries. So this happens within countries, and it happens across the world. And it's to do with the discovery of America, he mentions a few times, and just generally the growth of markets, right, the growth of and the importance of trade and commerce that comes along and changes the focus from land to capital, from the landed gentry to the burgesses in the towns and cities. So that's really the end of that old ruling class, right? That old aristocracy. That ends with the discovery of America. And so yeah, the bourgeoisie, and that's one of the reasons why he says the bourgeoisie is a revolutionary class, because they get rid of all that and all the sentiment and all of the reverence that went along with those relationships, with those sort of deference to these great aristocrats, goes out the window, right? It goes completely out the window when trade and commerce comes into play. So the bourgeoisie is very revolutionary at that time. Now, the other thing that the bourgeoisie does, he talks about, I think, a sorcerer, right, that brings these forces up from the netherworld and then loses control of them, right? So the bourgeoisie, it's destroyed all these old ways, and it's starting now to sort of revolutionize our economic system. We're seeing the large growth of cities, very quick, rapid, large growth of cities. Manchester is one of the first, right? Manchester in England, the Industrial Revolution we're talking about here, people flocking to cities, overcrowded cities, and these people who are coming to the cities, and they're coming to, we need the concentration of labor. We need vast amounts of men and women and children to work in these factories, in this manufacturing industry in Manchester and other cities that grow up around the same time, especially in the UK, in Germany, and in the United States, right, in the northeast of the United States. So these cities are starting to grow now, and it's bringing all these people together, and these people that they're bringing together is going to turn into a proletariat class, right? So they're bringing into being, the bourgeoisie are bringing into being this their downfall, right? This huge proletariat class, right? Who they rely on. I remember the master and slave narrative that we talked about with Hegel, right? This is remember that the master. At first, right, the slave is grateful to the master for saving his life and agrees to obey him. But over time, something happens, and the slave realizes that that the master actually needs him. The master needs the slave in order to be a master, right? And so there's something of that, right? This is directly from Hegel. This duality here, right? This synthesis, right? This thesis, antithesis, and synthesis we talked about in class, right? That was Alexia, I think, that brought that up. But this is it's coming from Hegel, right? The idea is coming from Hegel, but it's being applied to this situation here, where we've got this large poor class of workers that are sort of being brought into being by this bourgeoisie. But then the bourgeoisie comes to depend on the labor, right? They depend on the labor in order to be the bourgeoisie. They depend on the proletariat selling its labor, and so of course you're going to see as time goes on, right, that the expectation from Marx and Engels, right, is that that ultimately the proletariat frees itself from the oppression, right, that it's under, and again, like Hegel and the master and slave, the freeing of the proletariat also frees the bourgeoisie, right? Because the bourgeoisie is trapped in its own in the system that it made itself, and harmed by it. There's one thing I want to say. Well, there's one more question that I pulled out. It's this one, page 245. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. This is another reason why Marx and Engels say it's very revolutionary, right? Because it's always got to revolutionize the instruments of production, right? So that's going to be dangerous for itself, because once those change, it can threaten the foundation of the current system. So with that being said, I'm wondering if by this Marx and Engels think that innovation is what drives the survival of the bourgeoisie. I think yes. I think that's a good point, a good question, and I think it does. One thing that we haven't said very much about that I want to just mention, and I didn't see any questions about it, but there may have been some in there that I missed perhaps, but is the nature of bourgeoisie society and the proletariat, the working class. One of the important things about it is that the working class become alienated from their own labor, from the product of their own labor, in a couple of different ways. But one of the ways is that it used to be in the feudal system, you had these cottage industries, right? And you and me, we became specialists in, I don't know, we became weavers or something, right? And we were attached to our product. We made the product. Now, what do weavers make? Do they make clothing and cloth and stuff? We took the raw materials, right? We worked it with our own hands, and the thing that we made was, we made the complete product. Adam Smith, right, with his pin factory, remember, right, where, like to increase efficiency, we're going to have one person drawing out the iron, we're going to have another person putting the head on the pin. The making of a pin becomes sort of just a series of procedures, and each procedure is done by just one person. What I mean is one person does only one procedure. So instead of sort of taking the raw materials from the beginning and creating a product and at the end having some sort of pride in the product and seeing it through, now you're just doing some sort of meaningless procedure over and over and over again. You're never seeing the end product. You're alienated from the product of your labor in that way, right? That sort of work is, for Marx and Engels, human beings can't take joy in that. Right? They can take joy in taking those raw materials and doing all the steps themselves and creating a final product from it. They can take joy and they can be happy in that, but not from just doing one sort of meaningless process over and over and over again. So I wanted to talk about alienation a little bit, because that's what's supposed to lead to it fits into our overall narrative, right? That Marx and Engels are saying that the reverence, the sentimentality, the feeling, the goodness Goodness is too much for Mark. They're not going that far. But the sentimentality and the reverence that used to exist in the feudal system, and the connection between people, the relationships between even family relationships, Marx and Engels said that even that's ruined by bourgeois society. Even that comes down to just economic benefit. All those types of relationships, and the relationship between a person and the product of that person, what that person produces, it's all ruined, right? Or it's all desentimentalized. And I think Marx and Engels they're not as sentimental as I am, for example, and they don't care too much that it's desentimentalized. But there is one argument that they're making. They see that as progressive, right, and revolutionary. That those sort of mystical, perhaps in sort of a negative sense of the word, relationships are all being broken down. But one thing that the one thing that they do say will lead to a proletarian revolution is this alienation of the worker from his product. I've answered all the questions there. I give a little bit of my own thing. This is probably going to be quite a long video now. I hope that it was recording all this. That's always my fear. Actually, it's only 30 minutes. That's not too bad. But I'll leave you there. This is POS 210. We have our midterm on Friday. Good luck everybody with that. This is probably the last video that I'll make this week. I was going to do one on Robert Owen. In the end, I'm not doing that on Robert Owen. It's quite a short piece. Have a look at it. Notice in particular with Robert Owen, just notice how he thinks people are teachable, how he thinks that people's characters are not built by themselves. Like, I'm not in control of the character or my wants and desires. That comes from outside of me, right? It comes from the system. And so we can make people believe or behave or have the desires and the wants and the character that we decide as a society, right? We can give that to them. It's not something that they do themselves, right? It's inside of them. It's from outside in. That's, I think, an important contribution from Robert Owen in what we read. So do notice that. All right, I'll look forward to reading your stuff further and interacting as much as we can this way.